pleasure to introduce the first presenter, who is Anela Alic. Anela is going to be talking about the American newspaper perception of Al-Jazeera between 2001 and 2013. Certainly a very important time in the history of that news organization and as well as American newspapers. It's been a great pleasure to work with Anela. She has just had such a wonderful work ethic for this whole process. We had encountered a number of stumbling blocks, the interviews that didn't come through and so on, but she really persevered and has turned out what I think is a very interesting and important paper. So it's my pleasure to introduce Anela.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anela. Before I start, I would like to thank Dr. Atwood for being my advisor and for dealing with all the troubles that we went through. We lost our database in the middle of the research, but we managed to find a new one. And I would also like to thank to all other members of my committee, Dr. Latkovsky and Professor Bertuzoni. So as you already can see, my topic is American newspaper perception of Al-Jazeera from 2001 to 2013. Before I start, I would like to introduce Al-Jazeera a bit more to those who are not familiar with the brand. Al-Jazeera was founded by the Emir of Qatar in 1996 in Doha. That idea came to his mind because Arab media was extremely controlled by the government. So he wanted to open an independent news outlet, and he did. Al Jazeera started out as a small news channel in Doha, and now it operates from over 20 channels worldwide. It also broadcasts to over 250 million households across 130 countries. Why did I choose Al Jazeera and why did I choose this topic? First, because I was very fascinated with its unexpected success. Some of you might know that Al Jazeera was related to terrorist groups in its beginning, and it was called as terrorist network, and today we see it as a global, reliable and objective news source. And also in Al Jazeera, America opened, that was the proof of the previous statement I said. They expanded even to America. And I obtained an internship this summer there, actually in Al Jazeera Balkans, where I went through different issues when I would say to different people that I worked there. Some of them would react, are you working for the Al-Qaeda? Are you working for the Arabs? And some of them were actually amazed. So I wanted to see how Al Jazeera was portrayed in the States and by different news media. So in order to complete the study, I posted 3 research questions. First research question was, how was the growth of Al Jazeera as a news source reflected by American newspapers? Second question was, how did the media attention given the network change over time? And third question was, how did the network, the New York Times and the Washington Post view Al Jazeera between 2001 and 2013? My methodology was based on primary and secondary sources, but mostly on the ProQuest database, where I looked at the time frame of 13 years. My unit was any mention of Al Jazeera, and that yielded in a pretty large sample of 4,738 mentions. Therefore, I had to narrow it down by several methods. So first, I chose the New York Times and the Washington Post as 2 of the major newspapers in the United States. Then I eliminated all sports editorials and open ad pieces, so I just focused on the news. Next step was selecting 12 keywords that were related to reporting and journalism. And for my crucial part of my study, my third research question, I actually chose every third article, and that yielded in a small number of 109 articles from the New York Post, New York Times, and 47 articles from the Washington Post. So I already said my crucial part of this study was my third research question, where I wanted to see the perception. And how I did this, I actually graded the articles as positive, neutral, and negative. For example, here you see a positive article an article would be graded as positive if Al Jazeera was compared to CNN or other reliable sources. Negative articles would say that Al Jazeera was a mouthpiece of terrorists or was related to terrorists by either the journalist or other subjects in the article. And then neutral articles just had maybe a brief mention of Al Jazeera, that Al Jazeera reported something or said something, or neutral articles included both positive and negative views toward Al Jazeera. So that balanced out and you got a neutral article. So here are the examples so you can actually get a sense how this worked. In one of the articles for Al Jazeera double standard coverage by the Washington Post, Al Jazeera said that Al Jazeera was portrayed through this quote, Al Jazeera Arabic changed from the most important Arab media voice against US and European policies in the region to a champion and an apologist for such intervention. I guess it's pretty clear to see that Al Jazeera first was called as the Arab media voice against the United States, and now they call it the champion. A negative example from the New York Times, article US protests broadcast by Arab channels called Al Jazeera inaccurate, false, and that it is wrong reports that are designed to be inflammatory. And now the neutral article had two views. First was positive, aggressive coverage, which is always good in journalism. That means that the media outlet actually takes all effort to get to the scene and cover different information. And then they also called it in a negative way as the coverage to support Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza against their Lebanese and Palestinian rivals. Now we are moving on to my findings. First two charts will describe how I actually answered the first and second research question, that is related to the growth of Al Jazeera and what actually stimulated that growth. So first we'll look at the New York Times. New York Times yielded with 1,542 articles in the beginning. As you can see, it's pretty obvious that early 2000s had high number of articles mentioning Al Jazeera. That happened because of 2001 and 9/11 attacks, where Al Jazeera was related to broadcasting Bin Laden's photos and images. Then 2003 and 2004, we see that those are the years with the highest number of articles. It happened because Al Jazeera launched its Al Jazeera English website, and it also planned opening of Al Jazeera English channel. And that happened in 2006, and we see that there's again a high number of articles. From 2006 to 2011, the interest for Al Jazeera diminished. In 2011, Al Jazeera English was launched on a New York City's cable, so that spiked the interest for Al Jazeera in New York Times. In 2012 and 2013, although there was a decrease in the articles, it was still a high number because of Al Jazeera introducing Al Jazeera America to the United States. Now the Washington Post data, which actually is pretty similar to New York Times, except one of the outliers. So this the Washington Post yielded in 1,592 articles. First 2 years, just the same as the New York Times, 9/11 attacks happened. And then in 2003 and 2004, we see that there's a high number of articles again mentioning Al Jazeera because of Al Jazeera English website was launched. And also the Washington Post paid a lot of attention to the launch of Al Arabiya, which is the biggest competitor of Al Jazeera in the Arab world. From 2004 to 2006, there was a decline. In 2006, again, we see because of Al Jazeera English channel was launched, the Washington Post talked about Al Jazeera more than in the previous year. From 2006 to 2011, again, there is a steady decline, and because of the interest for Al Jazeera diminished. In 2011, as I already said, Al Jazeera English was launched on New York City's cable, and also there was another event that caused this. Al Jazeera actually released documents from Palestinian officials to concede East Jerusalem. So Washington Post wrote about it a lot. And then there is an outlier. 2013, this shows that Al Jazeera America actually was one of the biggest topics in Washington Post in 2013. Now moving on to the biggest part, the most important part of my research, that is the perception of Al Jazeera in these two newspapers. First, New York Times. Positive articles. New York Times yielded with 109 articles, and 50% of them were neutral, 22% were negative, and 28% were positive. And now we'll see how that looked. 2001 was a surprising year for me because I thought I would get mostly negative articles because 9/11 attacks happened and Al Jazeera was called a terrorist network. But on the contrary, New York Times actually talked about Al Jazeera as timely and newsworthy, and they compared it to CNN. 2003 and 2004 reported the highest number of negative articles. That happened because Al Jazeera launched and decided to actually broadcast graphic images of dead American soldiers from Iraq, and Al Jazeera was called in the New York Times as inaccurate. In from 2004 to 2012, we can see that negative articles started to diminish, which is proving that the negative perception started to disappear, and more neutral and positive articles appeared, especially towards the end, from 2011 to 2013, because Al Jazeera America was introduced. Now moving on to Washington Post. Washington Post data was a bit different than New York Times because I got a small sample of 47 articles, and also in New York Times we had first neutral, positive, then negative, and here it's different. Positive and negative articles almost prevailed after neutral. So you can see there, it's a small sample, so neutral and negative articles dominated the first 6 years, especially in 2003, because of the graphic images of dead American soldiers, where Washington Post called Al Jazeera disgusting and unacceptable, and they also called it out and said that Al Jazeera violated the Geneva Convention with those images. In 2010, we had only one article, which was negative, and where Washington Post called Al Jazeera a source that collected information from intelligence. And then the situation changes. From 2010 to 2013, there are more negative, more positive, and neutral articles, where the Washington Post called Al Jazeera independent and prominent. And it also in 2013, because of the expansion to America, the Washington Post called it far from being a mouthpiece of Arabic radicalists. I think it was pretty obvious that the perception toward Al Jazeera changed over this 13-year time frame. And I'm glad I had the chance to obtain this study and prove that the transformation happened. The only thing that I could add to this is maybe more newspapers and more articles, and set a base for further research, which could be a detailed analysis of the Al Jazeera America acceptance in the United States from the time when they opened in August 2013 until today. And that was my study. Thank you.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions, if anybody would like to ask some questions about our research.
Hi, Anela. I've read recently that Al-Jazeera America has just laid off people. Do you know anything about that, and can you comment on it?
It is because of the decline in views. They didn't meet their annual goal that they had in the first 2 quarters. They just didn't. The views didn't reach the number that they were expecting, so they couldn't pay off for the people in there.
Hi there. Fantastic work. I'm really interested in your methodology and how you were able to take this large sample and, of course, analyze it in some of these graphs in aggregate, but also you were able to examine smaller sections of that. And in particular, I think it was your second or third slide, you talked about how you started to take this larger data set and extract out meaningful articles. And one thing you mentioned was that you used 12 keywords. And I wondered if you could kind of expand upon that a bit and let us know what those keywords were, maybe a few of them, and why you chose them.
Okay, because ProQuest gives a whole lot of keywords. So Dr. Atuda and I wanted to focus just around journalism because it's Al Jazeera. So we, some of the words that I can remember were journalism, reporting, objectiveness, TV broadcast, everything what was related for Al Jazeera as a TV network. And I also added two keywords that were not really related to journalism because I wanted to see the perception, so I added terrorist and 9/11.
Is there a reason that you chose the New York Times and the Washington Post specifically?
I'm very familiar with it. It's because they're 2 major newspapers and they're the East Coast. So, but one part of my research actually examined all the 15 newspapers where I showed the actual growth in those newspapers.
Thank you.